You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back to the second hour of our program, sponsored in part by Chevrolet, because America deserves some credit. Qualified buyers can get low-rate financing on select 2008 and 2009 Chevy models. Length of the contract is limited. You can see your dealer for details, and you must take delivery for this special deal by March 31st, 09. This is the March sale. Let's talk about what President Obama was talking about in his most recent big speech. He's talking about teachers and schools, and frankly, I think it's wonderful that we're having this conversation. To some extent, this has been the province of the hard right in the United States for a long time because they hate public education. They hate the idea of egalitarian public education, the idea that people can raise themselves up, that it's a great way of maintaining a class or a caste system in a country. And we are now the least socially mobile country in the entire industrialized world. In other words, we are the most caste system country. We are the country where if you are born into poverty, the probabilities are the highest of any industrialized country in the world that you will die in poverty. Your children will be in poverty. And the same thing if you're born into wealth, that you will die in wealth and your children will die in wealth. And the middle class, of course, is shrinking. And one of the keys to this is education. It's an important one. But you can do it right or you can do it wrong. President Obama.
From the moment students enter a school, the most important factor in their success is not the color of their skin or the income of their parents. It's the person standing at the front of the classroom. That's why our Recovery Act will ensure that hundreds of thousands of teachers and school personnel are not laid off, because those Americans are not only doing jobs they can't afford to lose, they're rendering a service our nation cannot afford to lose either.
And there you go. And number one, the importance of our teachers. Okay. Then he gets into and by the way, how do you empower teachers? I mean, I've said for a long time on this show and in other venues that when we start paying our teachers and our police officers the way we pay senior executives in corporations, because frankly they hold our future much more than middle management at, fill in the blank company, particularly any of our banks. Then we're going to see some real change. You're going to see some real competition for those jobs and some great people. But that said, at the same time, I don't know anybody who's gone into teaching, and I've worked in the education field for many years. I've written 7 books about education. I'm up until this last year, I was the founder of, and I was on the board of directors of a school for learning disabled kids, the Hunter School. HunterSchool.org is the website up in New Hampshire, and I'm real familiar. I used to do teacher trainings. I've done teacher trainings from Los Angeles to Chicago to Atlanta to New York City. I've actually even in Europe, all around the country, and all around the world. And it's important, I think, for us to understand that there's no simple solution, but B, I think we need to reboot our education system from the ground up. First of all, understanding the history of public education. Public education as a modern event really didn't even exist until the 1700s, till the 18th century. And when it came into place in the 18th century, it came into place because there were all these orphanages. I mean, there was this major major trend of creating orphanages in Europe in the late 1600s. As a result in part of poverty, as a result in part of wars and whatnot. But anyhow, in Bohemia, there were uprisings in Prussia in 1719, 1723, 1762, a revolt in Eisenberg in 1765, peasant uprisings in Silesia. There was tremendous upheaval, social upheaval, and at the same time, there were these orphanages that were also doubling, in many cases, as brothels or as workhouses. This is, for example, not all the children in the orphanages only spun wool or silk, as Horst Kruger pointed out in his book Zur Geistische der Manufakturende, it goes on. In 1747, the government of Prussia issued an edict that children could not go out of their orphanages at night because so many of the orphanages were doubling as bordellos and their managers as procurers. Maria Theresa, the Queen of Austria, issued a similar edict in 1765. So what happened was that in the 1700s, in the mid-1700s, they developed what are called Spinnenschulen, spinning schools. You send your kids to these schools, and half the day they would spin clothing, and the other half the day they would teach the kids. They would educate them. This was the beginning of modern public education, and you know, it was a start. But they were trying very hard not to. I mean, of course, there had always been schools for the wealthy, but I'm talking about for the working people of Europe. In 1765, Frederick II put into place in Prussia, in what is now modern Germany, the first system of state-run compulsory schools, 1765. And he laid out the benefits for this. Number one, by molding young minds, it will be possible to create the belief that work is a necessary and moral imperative. Number two, schools will inculcate proper political opinions in the children. Never again would a generation grow up to revolt against its government. Number three, children would learn not to question authority or authority figures. In fact, Johann Heckler in 1740 in Prussia introduced institutionalized in the Prussian schools the concept of a child having to raise their hand and ask a question before they could be addressed. In other words, you must ask the question, "May I ask a question, please?" Number four, children would learn to accept their lot in life and to limit their aspirations. The need of the factories for workers and army for soldiers would be met with compliant recruits. And number five, children's primary loyalty, because school was compulsory, would be shifted from mother and father to king and state. In other words, they would see that the state was more powerful. And in 1763, at the end of the 7-Year War, King Frederick made this national. In 1765, Maria Theresa passed an identical, this was in Germany, passed an identical law in Austria, and on it went. Thus came this system. And so what we have is a school system. Horace Mann in the late 19th century in the United States pitching this thing to Massachusetts, where in Massachusetts they had this problem with the Catholics, all the Catholic immigrants who had come over from Ireland. And the majority of the population in Massachusetts by that point in the late 19th century was Catholic, particularly Boston, and yet the power structure in that state was Protestant. There was a Protestant secret society called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. That really was their name. They had a secret handshake, and their secret saying when they did their secret handshake was, "I know nothing." And that "I know nothing," you know, the secret handshake, was why it was called the Know Nothing Legislature. The Know Nothing Legislature in the late 19th century in the UK, in Massachusetts. And Horace Mann went to them and said, you know, you guys are worried about the Catholics taking over. You're worried about the Catholics running the country, taking over the country. Here's how you break the back of the Catholics. Now, he had been trying to sell the German-style public education. He went over to Germany. In 6 months, you could get a PhD in Germany back in the day. They invented the PhD, being a professor of philosophy, a doctor of philosophy. It was something that was invented in Germany in the 19th century. So, Horace Mann, he couldn't get anybody to buy it. He was going around to all these corporations saying, you should encourage schools, public schools, mandatory public schools, because they will train compliant workers. You will have an educated workforce. All the things that I just laid out. No corporation would buy it. So he finally sold it to the legislature of Massachusetts in the late 1800s, and they put into place compulsory public schools because the Catholics had been homeschooling their kids or schooling them in private local community schools. They put in place these public schools, and it succeeded. There were revolts against it. There was a fight against it, but it succeeded. So now we have public schools that to a large extent came out of social engineering experiments, and that also came out of a time in the United States when we were an agricultural society. So as a consequence of our being an agricultural society, we let kids out of school during the summer so that they could help bring in the crops. I mean, there's all these anachronistic pieces built into our public school system. I want to tell you after the break about some school systems that I saw when I was working in this field a decade ago, when I was traveling around the world, when I was doing consulting to schools, school systems that I saw that really worked, and things that can be done with our schools here, and raise the question, and open it up for conversation. How do we compensate teachers? How do we reinvent schools? And how do we do it in ways that don't turn schools into just another for-profit enterprise? Because when we begin going down that road, and that is the road, tragically, that some charter schools, some states, Washington State, for example, doesn't allow charter schools. Oregon, just south of it, no limit on charter schools. Some states say it can't be for-profit. Other states say it's fine if it's for-profit. We start getting to for-profit education in the public school system. It's like for-profit health care. It could be a disaster. How do we do this and make it work? Right after this.